We've all heard that an image says more than 1,000 words. So how can you use that to your advantage when dealing with your mental health? Welcome to the Ship Psychology channel. My name is Crystal Vogels, and as your counselor today, we'll be talking about imagery. Sometimes when you read a book, the writer takes pages and pages to describe a certain scene or a landscape. Why would you need so many words to describe what is essentially just one snapshot? Well, that is because the majority of our brain does not think with words. The majority of our brain thinks in images. So an image is much easier to process. Typically, only the captain of the ship inside our head uses words. And that is because the parts of the brain that have to do with written language and the interpretation of language are literally located within the neocortex. The rest of the brain, that is, the rest of the crew, they don't use language as a primary means of communication. The reptilian brain thinks mostly in terms of actions. That's where fight or flight comes from, either punch it or run away. Whereas the first mate in particular thinks in music, thinks in sounds, in images. And feelings specifically let themselves be expressed in images much better than into words. It is very difficult to find words to describe how you're feeling. Because words are the captain's domain, and the captain doesn't understand the first thing about emotions. And they can lend their words, but then still the first mate thinks, feels. This feels like. Let's say that the love of my life told me that, he didn't want anything to do with me. And that just breaks my heart. I feel heartbroken. It feels like my heart shatters in my chest. And as I say that, as my first mate shares that image, just with a handful of words, with that metaphor, shares that image, you likely already have a literal image of a porcelain heart breaking, shattering, all those shards. And you empathize. Your first mate says, that image, I recognize that. I understand what that is supposed to mean. And I can understand how that heartbreak feels. And that's how first mates communicate. The majority of our brain communicates like that. Because even the captain with their words often uses images to support those words. And what just happened is that two first mates have an understanding of a certain feeling. They share a certain feeling because they share an image. And that is exactly what your brain is trying to do with you. The waking consciousness is often dominated by the captain, who doesn't really understand emotions. So the first mate will use images to share what they want to tell. And they will communicate with your captain. Your first mate communicates with your captain and with your deckhand with images, by showing images. That's why you have dreams. That is your brain giving an image, giving shape to a feeling. If you're at night, if you're terrified of something following you, then that something will be given a shape, will be given an image. And maybe it's a mask, a guy in a hockey mask. Or maybe it's, don't ask me why, but I was always chased by dinosaurs, by T-Rexes. After a while, you realize that whenever you've dreamt of that particular image, the guy in the hockey mask, or in my case, the dinosaurs chasing me, that corresponded with the same kind of feeling. But the majority of our dreams are not that structured. The majority of our dreams are haphazard images. Literally the first thing that comes to the first mate's mind when they are sorting out and processing certain feelings. So it's difficult to explain what a dream means if you even remember it, if you even remember what images you saw. It's very difficult to pinpoint, okay, what was going on and why did I dream that and what are my brains trying to tell me? But there's also these things as recurring dreams. Maybe you've had them yourself, or maybe you've only heard of them, but it's a fairly common phenomenon that people have dreams, certain images that keep coming back. Having to do a test in school, even though you did your exams 20 years ago, that's a very common one that keeps coming back. Being chased, and very often being chased by the same danger. When you look at these dreams, you will find that the images correspond with the same feeling. So for example, when there is something in your life right now that feels like you have to do an exam, you're being examinated and judged based on your performances, like the way you would be when someone marks your exam. That typically is when exam dreams come back. So the brain uses haphazard images, but it can, when something is strong and recurring and important, assign the same images to that same feeling. And assigning a visual representation to the same meaning, that is language. That is your brain talking to you. That means that you can learn to understand the vocabulary that your brain is using. And that is what the ship inside your head does. The ship is the representation of your body, your relationship with your body and yourself. Your captain is the representation of your rational thoughts, your rational waking consciousness, decisions you make, what is right and wrong, law, not morality, but law, the rules. That is your captain. Your first mate is a representation of your emotions, of your creativity, your drive, your playfulness, your passions, your morality. That's not the captain, that's the first mate. What is important to you, that is represented by the first mate. And then your instinct, who you are at the deepest of your core, what are absolutely non-negotiable boundaries for you, what you will defend come hell and high water. That is your deckhand. Your deckhand represents that. And once you learn to recognize these figures and recognize what they look like to you, how they appear to you, you can find that when something changes, that is meaningful. But you also know what to look for. So if something changes about your captain, then apparently there is a discrepancy between what you feel you should do and what you agree with that you should do. If something happens to your first mate, a very common one that almost all of my clients describe is that when your first mate, when you are feeling happy and exuberant and you have hope and you want to go forward, then the first mate almost glows. They're happy, they're bouncing around like a child, and they're very, very energetic and colorful. But when they feel down and scared, they shrink in size. They become grey and dull and withdrawn, and oh, but what if this and what if that? And so you can tell by the way they look, by the way they dress, by the way they behave in your mind. When you picture them, you can tell how you are feeling in this moment. And because you have this set situation to go to, you have the ship at sea, you have different kinds of weather. Is there a storm coming, or is there fair wind? by looking at how the crew looks, what they do, how they behave. Are they out and about on deck and are they happily chatting to each other, or has your captain locked themselves up in the cabin and doesn't want to speak to anyone? Hold on, what's going on here? What's happening? What's wrong? Then you can recognize that and address it. And what you can also notice is that as you develop, as you grow, as your confidence grows, as you resolve old issues and find new ways in life, that will reflect in your ship and your crew as well. So you, like me, you might start out with a half-rotten 3-masted ship with gaps in the hull that really was being held together by shoestrings and the captain's sheer willpower, all the way to a beautiful, white, glowing, 4-masted ship that is gold trimmed and has beautiful white sails that are in perfect condition and that can withstand any kind of weather. It takes some time to get from one to the other, but these changes in you are reflected by how you picture your ship. And you don't have to put effort into picturing your ship, because your brains are sharing these images with you. The ship and her crew, the captain, the first mate and the deckhand, they are archetypes. When I tell you, picture a captain, you immediately have an image of what such a person looks like. When I invite you to picture your captain, that may look different. That person may look different from the original archetype that you had in mind. But you do know, this is my captain. They may even have a name. Maybe not, maybe they do. And the same is true for the ship, the same is true for the first mate, the deckhand, and indeed anyone else on board. And all you have to do is just sit back, close your eyes and think, my ship. What does my ship look like? And you'd be amazed at what kind of different answers people will give. Answers that are perfectly suited to how they see themselves and how they experience life there in that moment. It's a vocabulary of images. And with that, and wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever you're doing, you can always check in with your ship, check in with yourself. How do I feel? What is going on? I'm feeling anxious. Why? Is it the deckhand who feels anxious? Is it the first mate who feels anxious? Is it the captain who feels anxious? Because they each have their own reasons, because they have their own tasks. They have their own reasons to be anxious. And when the first mate is anxious, it's usually for social reasons. Oh, what will people say? Oh, I'm not sure if I dare to do that. I'm not sure. What if I make a fool of myself? Whereas the captain is more likely to be anxious. What if I misjudge the situation? What if I make the wrong decision? What if I miscalculated something? And that way you can more easily pinpoint where your feelings come from, where your anxiety stems from. And when you know what it is, where it comes from, you also know where the solution is. Because a first mate has different reasons to be anxious and has different needs to help them calm down, to take away that anxiety. For example, a captain can be pacified with explanations, with rational explanations. But if your first mate is anxious or your deckhand, those explanations of your captain, never mind someone else's captain, are going to fall flat. If your first mate is anxious, your captain can say, yeah, well, the other person is trying to tell you it's going to be all right. They have a point, they do, but your first mate doesn't believe it. Your captain does, but your first mate doesn't. That's when you can say, well, I know this is true, but I don't feel it. It doesn't land. And there's a discrepancy. But you can feel these things. You can see that. And what your crew looks like matters.